How many of you clap? How many of you know what ChatGPT is? Okay. So, well, not very many.
ChatGPT continues to be a topic of conversation for many months now, and people keep finding new uses for the chatbot. But did you know that in its early stages after its launch, the tool was full of controversy given how users were able to abuse its vast knowledge for illegal and immoral activities? Perhaps you heard that ChatGPT was asked to write very compelling phishing emails to better scam people. Or perhaps you heard that ChatGPT could even give you perfect instructions on how to bury a body and not get caught. Well, as it turns out, ChatGPT's developer, OpenAI, quickly put on the brakes for ChatGPT and made the tool much safer. Or rather, it created guardrails that prevented users from abusing its language processing capabilities. But what most people don't know is how OpenAI achieved this goal, which was by exploiting vulnerable workers in Kenya to awful working conditions. So what did these workers have to do? Who are they? And why were their stories left in the shadows? In this video, we're going to explore the dark side of ChatGPT that OpenAI tried hard to keep hidden. To understand why these workers were hired to begin with, we must first understand just a little of how ChatGPT works. ChatGPT uses two methods to learn. Those are supervised and unsupervised learning. Supervised learning is a bit like a 5-year-old kid reading an encyclopedia with the help of their parents. But what happens when the kid grows up and wants to strike out on their own? That's where unsupervised learning comes in. It's like a 5-year-old spending hours on all kinds of Reddit forums, exploring and discovering new things on their own. However, as you may have guessed through the adjective in the name of the training model, the downside of unsupervised is that it has no limit to the data that it can feed off of. And when we say no limit, we really mean it. In fact, ChatGPT reaches beyond just basic web pages and books. It dives into the deep corners of the web, where even the most daring of humans fear to tread. Yes, we're talking about shady forums that discuss everything from sex to violence to guns and everything in between. And as you might have guessed, its limitless ability to learn from both the good and the really bad side of the internet will certainly have its consequences. Among the worst examples included how ChatGPT was used to create malicious software, which when installed in your computer can steal your user ID and password to sensitive accounts. ChatGPT was even able to create multiple versions of the same malware, making them ever so difficult to detect and stop completely. In another instance, we hinted earlier that ChatGPT was able to write convincing phishing emails by applying its vast knowledge of social engineering, making them even more difficult for even technologically savvy people to recognize. And of course, none of us would want AI to be producing such content, and the creators of ChatGPT, OpenAI, also know that this is not good for business. Therefore, they've been very upfront about the AI's shortcomings and continue to do everything in their power to fine-tune ChatGPT. However, the most surprising thing is that the steps they're taking to salvage the situation are even more ludicrous than the problem that they're trying to solve. In fact, this step is one that has to do with exploitation, deception, and human misery. It turns out that OpenAI has been outsourcing the labor-intensive task of training ChatGPT to freelance workers in Kenya. You might be thinking that they must have been paid well, especially considering that OpenAI is backed by tech giants like Microsoft and Amazon. However, the reality was quite different. According to a Time investigation, these workers were earning less than $2 an hour for their work, far below even the Kenyan minimum wage of $4 an hour. Who would have expected that a technology developed by the world's most powerful tech firms could be so exploitative? As we mentioned earlier, OpenAI had been sourcing the data it used to train ChatGPT from billions of words scraped from the internet. And to prevent any data relating to racism or sexism from creeping into their AI, the company needed to ensure that the data it fed into it was properly filtered and labeled so the AI could learn to detect those forms of toxicity in the wild and do away with them. But who would do this tedious job of labeling? OpenAI had an answer: outsource the task to some of the world's poorest citizens in Kenya. And so, with no recourse to complain or protest, thousands of workers were forced to spend their days sifting through some of the darkest material on the internet and labeling it as violent, hateful, or sexually explicit. That too for the lowest rate of $2 per hour. According to the reports, the outsourcing partner in Kenya, Sama, claims that it has helped lift more than 50,000 people out of poverty. But the truth is not as rosy. It's totally the opposite. In fact, what we're going to dive into now is the darkest secret that ChatGPT is hoping that doesn't get out there. But it has. In fact, the workers were stuck in an endless cycle of exposure to graphic and disturbing content. They had to pour through images and texts containing hate, violence, racism, sexism, and sexual exploitation for hours at a time. One worker described the worst experience he's ever encountered while reading and labeling text for OpenAI. A graphic description of a man having sexual intercourse with a dog in the presence of a young child. That was torture, he said. You'll read a number of statements like that throughout the week. By the time it gets to Friday, you're disturbed from thinking through that picture. Other workers have spoken out about finding images of extreme violence and cruelty, like people being tortured and executed, that have no doubt impacted them deeply, leaving lasting psychological scars. However, it wasn't just the content that they were exposed to that was traumatizing. The labor conditions themselves were often exploitative. The labor conditions themselves were a never-ending nightmare, straight out of a horror movie. Reports suggest that workers were forced to work for long hours with no breaks, no job security, and no benefits. The only thing that they could count on was their trusty computers, which were often crammed so tightly together that they could barely move. Rumor has it that if a worker tried to stretch, they risked falling into the lap of their neighbor. Talk about intimacy. But that's not even the worst part. Some workers had daily quotas that were impossible to meet, yet they still had to try. Imagine working for 10 hours straight, trying to hit an impossible quota, and then finding out that you'd be paid the same as someone who barely did anything. It's like a never-ending game of whack-a-mole, but instead of cute little moles, it's your soul that's getting crushed. And if that wasn't enough, workers had no freedom to speak out against their employers or to take any action against their mistreatment. They were trapped, like hamsters in a wheel, going round and round with no way out. It's a wonder they didn't all go mad. Now, despite this, many of the workers saw their wages as hugely beneficial to their families, in some cases being much higher than what they could make elsewhere in Kenya. This gives them some comfort and hope, despite the heavy psychological toll that such work can take on a person. Though the work is helping to lift some people out of poverty, it's still a difficult situation for those involved. Ultimately, it remains to be seen if the use of AI tools for human-powered tasks is really worth the cost, or if it's ultimately exploitative and damaging in the long run. However, regardless of what it is, the fact still remains that at least for now, if we want to build better AI free of toxicity, we still need the help of humans to do the dirty work of labeling the data to help them learn how to pick the good stuff and drop the bad stuff. Nevertheless, it's clear that those who are at risk of exploitation should receive more protection when engaging in such activities, and that companies need to take responsibility for the welfare of their workers. To do this, companies must be honest about their use of human labor and take steps to protect those who are at risk of exploitation or abuse. Only then can we ensure that we're taking the right steps forward toward the ethical advancement of humanity. What do you think is a better way to safeguard or train the AI? Let us know in the comment section below. And for more videos on ChatGPT, watch this video next.